Welcome to VSOW. Today we're diving into a real hot-button issue, uh, book bans. Specifically in Florida. It feels like things are really coming to a head there.
Yeah, it's like you've got this huge surge in book bans happening right now, and then you've got this long history in America of trying to suppress knowledge, particularly Black literacy.
And that's what we're going to dig into today, is this wave of book bans in Florida. Could this actually be seen as some kind of modern-day echo of that historical struggle for Black literacy?
It's a really interesting question.
We've got some great sources to help us unpack this. Dangerous Learning, the South's Long War on Black Literacy. That gives us a lot of the historical background.
Right.
We've also got news articles about that recent book disposal incident at New College of Florida.
Oh, yeah, that was a wild one.
And we've got some policy analysis of Florida's current book banning laws.
You know what strikes me? It's not just about individual books being challenged here. It feels bigger than that.
Definitely, it feels like Florida's become like the epicenter of this movement. It's like they're trying to reshape the entire educational landscape. It's this idea that certain ideas are just too dangerous, too controversial, too sensitive for young minds.
Right.
But to really understand what's going on now, I think we need to go back in time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, denying literacy to enslaved people was a cornerstone of control back then.
Like if they couldn't read,
Yeah.
they couldn't communicate,
Right.
organize,
Exactly.
challenge the system.
It was all about maintaining that power structure. That benefited from them being kept in the dark.
And they went to some pretty extreme lengths to prevent literacy.
Yeah, punishments were severe, often brutal.
But even in the face of that danger, enslaved people still found ways to learn, to read, to write.
It was a form of resistance, a path towards freedom.
It's like the story of Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
He risked everything to teach himself to read and write.
He's such a powerful example.
For him, it wasn't just about getting knowledge. It was about claiming his humanity,
Absolutely.
his right to self-determination.
You see that same link between literacy and empowerment all through history, right up to the book ban debate we're having today.
Okay. It's about being able to think for yourself, form your own opinions, challenge the narratives that people are trying to impose on you.
Exactly.
But this fight didn't end with slavery. Even after Reconstruction, there were still new tactics being used to limit Black education
Yeah.
and access to knowledge.
Things like literacy tests to stop Black people from voting,
Oh,
or setting up completely separate and unequal school systems.
So these were still deliberate attempts to maintain that racial hierarchy.
Absolutely, just using more evolved methods.
So how does all of this connect to what we're seeing in Florida right now? Are we witnessing some new, more subtle form of knowledge suppression?
Well, let's take a look at some of the books that are being challenged. Titles like Genderqueer, The Bluest Eye, All Boys Aren't Blue.
What do those books all have in common?
They explore themes of race, gender identity, and social justice
And they're being targeted for.
for containing what some people consider to be sensitive content.
But sensitive to whom? And who gets to decide what's appropriate for everyone else? Is this really about protecting children? Or is there something else going on here?
It's interesting because the justifications for these bans, they often sound a lot like the arguments used to suppress Black literacy in the past. This idea that certain knowledge is dangerous.
Yeah.
Or disruptive. Or morally
So
corruptive.
they're using the same playbook,
Yeah.
just with different targets.
Hmm.
And maybe a bit more sanitized language?
That's a good way to put it. And this brings us to Florida's really unique position. They're at the forefront of this whole movement.
They have the highest number of book bans in the entire country.
Yeah. And their approach is particularly aggressive.
It's not just about individual schools or libraries making decisions anymore.
Yeah.
It's statewide legislation.
Driven by groups like Moms for Liberty.
What are they trying to do?
They want to control what's considered acceptable reading material for an entire generation.
Wow.
Like, look at HB 1069. That law says any book challenged for sexual conduct has to be removed immediately while it's under review.
So just being flagged is enough.
Exactly. It doesn't even have to be deemed inappropriate. It's created this huge chilling effect.
So people are just removing books left and right out of fear.
Yeah, basically.
And then you've got laws like HB 1467 and that so-called Don't Say Gay bill.
Right.
Those give parents a lot of power to challenge books.
And force schools to respond.
It's like the whole system is designed to create fear,
And self-censorship,
where educators are afraid to even touch certain topics.
if it might be considered controversial.
So are we seeing a deliberate attempt to whitewash history, to silence voices that challenge the dominant narrative?
That's a really important question. And to answer it, I think we need to look closer at the specific types of books being targeted and what that tells us about the motivations behind these bans.
Okay, so let's do that.
Let's dive into some of these specific titles that are causing all this controversy. Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe is a good example. It's a graphic memoir that explores gender identity and sexuality.
I've heard of that one.
And it's been challenged a lot for its visual content and for exploring LGBTQ plus themes.
It seems like any books dealing with gender and sexuality are really vulnerable right now. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson has also been pulled from library shelves in a bunch of different districts.
Right. That one explores masculinity,
Yeah.
race, and growing up queer.
And the objections to these books usually focus on the idea that they're exposing kids to things that are inappropriate for their age.
Yeah.
But what about the kids who are actually struggling with these issues? What about the impact that these books could have on them?
Exactly. For those kids, seeing themselves reflected in literature can be so validating.
It can help them feel seen,
Hmm.
understood, less alone. If you
Yeah.
take those stories away, it's like you're telling them that their experiences are wrong or shameful.
Yeah, and it's not just LGBTQ plus themes either. Books dealing with race and racism are facing a lot of scrutiny too.
Toni Morrison's The Buddhist Eye comes to mind.
Oh yeah, that one's been challenged a lot.
It's considered a literary masterpiece. But some people say it's too graphic or disturbing for young readers.
It's a powerful novel, though. It explores the impact of racism and sexual abuse on a young black girl.
And by trying to silence those narratives, aren't we just trying to sanitize history,
Hmm.
avoid all the uncomfortable truths?
It makes you wonder who benefits from that kind of sanitization, whose perspective is being centered, and whose experiences are being erased.
This push to restrict certain kinds of literature goes beyond individual titles, too. We're also seeing this effort to limit discussions of critical race theory in schools.
CRT has become so controversial,
It examines the systemic nature of racism in American history and society.
and a lot of people are really opposed to it.
They say it's divisive,
Mm.
or that it teaches white children to hate themselves.
Yeah.
But isn't that a really simplistic interpretation?
CRT isn't about blame or guilt. It's about acknowledging the historical and ongoing impact of racism.
And understanding how it still shapes our society today.
It's about asking tough questions and having honest conversations, even when those conversations are uncomfortable.
If we shut down those conversations,
Mhm.
we're just going to perpetuate a cycle of ignorance and inequality.
Exactly.
You know, this whole discussion reminds me of that recent incident at New College of Florida, where they threw out all those books.
Oh, yeah.
Hundreds of them. A lot of them focused on marginalized groups. Just dumped them right into dumpsters.
It was pretty shocking.
It caused a lot of outrage and debate.
It seemed like a really isolated incident at first, but it actually reflects these broader trends we're seeing in Florida.
What do you mean?
Well, the college said it was just routine disposal of old materials, but the timing was interesting.
How so?
It happened right after Governor DeSantis appointed all those new trustees.
Oh, right.
And a lot of people were worried that it was part of a bigger effort to reshape the college's identity and limit academic freedom.
It felt very symbolic, like they were purging ideas that they didn't like.
Yeah, and it raised concerns about the chilling effect this could have on educators and institutions
What if professors and librarians are afraid to even stock certain books?
out of fear of backlash or reprisal.
We're basically creating an environment where knowledge itself is suspect.
It's a dangerous path to go down.
So what are the consequences of these book bans, both in Florida and across the country? What happens when we start limiting access to certain ideas and perspectives?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it has some pretty profound implications for the future of our society.
So when we're talking about the consequences of these book bans, we need to think about it from two angles, the individual level and the societal level. So first, on that individual level, what does it do to young people when they can't access stories that reflect their own experiences, or stories that introduce them to different ways of seeing the world?
It's like you're closing off these whole avenues of exploration and self-discovery. Imagine growing up without ever seeing yourself in a book, or without anything that challenges your assumptions about the world.
Right? It's like you're stuck in this really limited, potentially distorted view of reality.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like being told that certain parts of yourself, certain experiences, certain ideas, they're just not acceptable or worth exploring.
And that can have a huge impact on how a young person sees themselves and their place in the world.
And it goes beyond just those individual stories being silenced, too. It's about the impact these bans have on educators
Mm.
and on the whole learning environment.
Right.
If teachers are afraid to talk about certain topics or include certain books
Yeah.
because they're worried about backlash,
You create this climate of fear and self-censorship.
and that doesn't benefit anyone.
Mm.
Students should be encouraged to question things, to explore, to engage with all different kinds of perspectives.
Absolutely.
So that on that societal level, these book bans just feed into the polarization and division that's already happening.
When we suppress certain narratives and perspectives, we're basically reinforcing existing power structures and silencing anyone who dissents.
It creates this us versus them mentality,
Yeah.
where no one wants to listen to anyone else.
And it makes it almost impossible to find common ground and actually address the complex challenges we're facing.
A healthy democracy needs that free exchange of ideas. It
Yep.
needs the ability to challenge the status quo.
Exactly.
And book bans just undermine all of that.
They create this environment where knowledge itself becomes suspect and certain voices are just deemed unacceptable.
So where do we go from here? How do we fight back against these attempts to restrict our access to knowledge? How do we make sure that all voices are being heard?
It starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves and educate others about how dangerous censorship is and how important intellectual freedom is.
What else can we do?
We can support organizations like the ACLU. They're doing a lot to fight these bans.
And we need to advocate for policies that protect our right to read and our right to learn.
Absolutely.
And we can't forget about the power of our own voices. Speak out against book bans in your own communities.
Right.
Challenge the people who support censorship and talk about why diverse perspectives are so important.
Don't underestimate the power of your voice. You can make a difference.
The fight for Black literacy was a long and difficult one, and we need to learn from that history if we want to protect the freedoms we have today.
This isn't just about books. It's about our fundamental right to access knowledge.
And about the power that knowledge gives us to shape our own lives and shape our society.
This deep dive has really highlighted those alarming parallels between historical attempts to suppress Black literacy and what's happening with these book bans today, particularly in Florida.
It's a wake-up call, and it's time to do something about it.
We encourage you to check out the sources we've talked about, share your thoughts, and most importantly, keep these conversations going.
Don't let them silence the stories that need to be told. And don't let them silence the voices that need to be heard.
And don't forget to subscribe to VSOW. Like this episode and leave us a comment. We love hearing from you.
Your engagement helps us keep these conversations going.
Thank you for listening.